Hey, Zach, I am a little confused by this wording. An exhalation biased spine compensates with an inhaled wide infrasternal angle. If they are in an exhaled state, wouldn't that mean the ISA would present narrow? Thanks. Amazing question. I've moved a bit away from the inhalation exhalation terminology because it's kind of confusing and it requires you understanding what normal respiratory mechanics are. And so if you don't have that requisite understanding, well, you're kind of SOL. So let me give you some S so you can get L, if you know what I mean. So inhalation, exhalation, spine. When we talk about that in particular, this person's using an inhalation strategy or an exhalation strategy. We're talking about components of normal respiratory mechanics. One. Two, we're using the axial skeleton, the spine, as the reference point. Think of a normal, I'm going to scare quotes the hell out of normal, a normal spine having alternating curves of kyphosis and lordosis. Kyphosis would be present in the sacrum and the thorax. Lordosis would be present in the lumbar spine and the cervical spine. From that position, if you take a breath of air in, imagine this force that's pushing all of the curves posteriorly. What I mean by that is, boom, I got viscera downstairs pushing the sacrum back, counternutation, reducing the lumbar lordotic curve because that's getting pushed back. If I had a thorax, that would also be pushed backwards as well. So you potentially might see like an increase in general kyphosis. You'd see a reduction in the lumbar lordosis, so on and so forth. So that's an inhalation strategy. And generally within the body, you're going to see expansion or the entirety of the body getting bigger. External rotation is going to be driven, lots of things like that. But for our intents and purposes, since we're talking about nomenclature, focus on the spine. With an exhalation-based strategy, you get the reverse of that. Now, to squeeze the air out, I'm going to compress the body in all directions. You're going to have now an anterior directed force, bringing the spine back to its normal resting position. So you'll see from the inhaled position a sacral nutation. You'll see a return of the lumbar lordosis. You'll see a reduction of the thoracic kyphosis, so on and so forth. In the case of someone who has a restriction of movement options, we would argue that there is likely a restriction in respiratory variability because every time you breathe in and breathe out, the body has to move. So if there's limitations in that mechanism, you got problems. Your two strategies are either being more biased towards the inhalation side of things getting pushed backwards, roundedness through the spine, or you're more biased towards the exhaled side of things. Back is more flattened. Forces are directed anteriorly. Now, you still have to be able to complete the other end of the respiratory cycle. If you're more inhalation biased, well, you still got to exhale. But what if the normal respiratory mechanism wasn't available to you? What if you couldn't reverse the curves of the spine? You still got to finish the breath. So how are you going to do that? Well, I'm glad you asked. That's where the compensatory breathing strategy comes into play. And one of the first places that you'll see this will be at the lower rib cage. That's why we measure the infrasternal angle, and it's so important. And why the lower rib cage? Well, due to the lack of the common sternal attachment, you have this connections, the false ribs, so they're connected to the costal cartilage, the floating ribs, the flautas. They don't have any attachment. So there's a lot more flexibility in that area to adapt to potential compensatory strategies. If you want to learn more, Diane Lee's got a good article that talks about this. I'll link it in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com /limitations. And also, if you're tuning in on that Instagram, baby, you definitely want to check it out, because I don't know if y'all know this, I've been also blogging and writing like some nice blogs along with this to help support your learning, because I care about you that much. So more flexibility in the lower rib cage. And if someone is more inhalation biased, they can utilize an exhalation strategy to try to complete the respiratory cycle. But now we've dived into compensatory mechanics. Instead of having that circumferential and multi-directional expansion and compression of the body when you breathe in, now you got a situation where I have a stagnant spine or ventral cavity, and I'm getting more of the motion through the lower rib cage. So an inhaled spine will compensate with an exhaled lower rib cage. That is a narrow infrasternal angle presentation. Caveat with that: just because the lower rib cage is exhaled, it doesn't mean that the diaphragm has fully ascended. It just mimics the position of an exhaled diaphragm. So think about it this way. If I'm using an inhalation spinal strategy, that means I'm going to have air in the lungs. The diaphragm ascending helps evacuate air. So if you got all this air cramping up your stelo and the thorax, well, you might not be able to push out because of compensatory strategies. So the other option, to mimic the narrowing of the lower rib cage, would be to descend the diaphragm even further. There's a good article, journal article that was done by like the OG himself, Andre Detroyer, where he talks about how if the diaphragm flattens or descends towards flattening, the pull that it has on the lower rib cage inverts. Under normal circumstances, the rib cage would move outward and upward, the bucket handle mechanism. When it goes to flat, the attachment of the diaphragm pulls the rib cage inward. That's how you can get the narrow infrasternal angle. Narrow infrasternal angle is a compensatory measure for an inhaled spine. An exhaled spine, forces pushing everything anterior, nutated sacrum, increased lumbar lordosis, flat AF T-spine, what you gonna do about it? That person, to exhibit compensatory respiratory mechanics, will instead have an inhaled lower rib cage. That's your wide infrasternal angle. So you can see the ISA is a compensatory mechanism for what the spine cannot do. You can see how it's kind of confusing because you have to have some understanding of the respiratory mechanics. 1. 2, another reason why I don't use this as much is I don't want people to think that because I have this inhaled strategy, can I push my ISA so I have a crazy exhaled strategy? Because if you look at articles like the torso integration hypothesis, or there's this really good book that I've been diving into called, I was just reading it on the plane actually, Body Mechanics in Health and Disease by Goldthwaite. I don't know how it's pronounced, but this will be in the show notes for sure. A lot of this is structural in nature, and we can look at this from like a respiratory dynamic standpoint, but the reason why you have these specific biases has to do with your build and your anthropometrics. This matters, and I think this is much more meaningful because now we can work with people's movement restrictions based on these structural biases that people have. And we can look at it from this respiratory standpoint, from a nomenclature perspective. But what I find easier, personally, is looking at it as one of two things. So you can either, if I'm looking at a lateral view, you can look at it as either this person is more biased towards being concentric on the back, or this person is more biased to being concentric on the front. And this has to do with the compensatory strategy a person is going to utilize to maintain upright posture, among other things. For the person who's got a narrow infrasternal angle, inhaled axial skeleton, remember, forces are pushing that spine backwards. So if you don't want to fall, you're going to concentrically bias stuff on the front to upright you. That's the first layer of compensation. So narrow ISA, inhale axial skeleton, concentric on the front, eccentric on the back. Unless there's secondary compensation, stay tuned, we'll talk about it. The wide infrasternal angle, they're getting pushed forward because of the exhalation strategy. So sacrum's going to nutate. I don't want to fall, so in order to prevent the fall, I'm going to concentrically bias stuff on the back to upright me. Concentric on the back, wide infrasternal angle, exhaled spine, eccentric on the front. To me, that is much easier to think about. And then we can think better about what we need to prioritize from an intervention standpoint by thinking of it that way. I think understanding the normal respiratory mechanics are important, but because we deal mostly with compensatory and a lot of this is anthropometric bias, I have moved a bit away from using this nomenclature, and I think it minimizes confusion. If you're a narrow, your first bias is concentric on the front. If you're wide, your first bias is concentric on the back. And if you have either of those problems, go ahead and talk to Zach.